Hello and good evening. I'm Rohit Gandhi and you're watching Gravitas tonight. We discuss something that affects us all, terrorism. Every day, the world wakes up to terrorist acts that are savage in nature, ruthless in their play out and designed to shock the public at large. Here are some mind-numbing images that the world has seen in this last year. The visuals that follow are graphic in content and viewer discretion is advised. Shocking that those images exist, all in public domain. Tonight on Gravitas, we talk about what goes on inside the mind of a terrorist. What motivates and sustains them? How can they be so recognizable, human in some ways, and yet be decidedly inhuman in their acts? It is a warped psychology at play, or it is just another day at work for these terrorists. What drives them to brag about their exploits? These are just some of those questions that are part of a rather complex issue that we are talking about tonight. But first, let's take a look at this report.
We have become accustomed to terror in different parts of the world. What we have not got used to is the savagery and brutality with which it is inflicted. In 1991, an LTTE suicide bomber, Dhanu, blows up former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in full public view, reducing him to a bloodied mass. 1993, Sri Lankan President Premadasa is assassinated in a May Day parade by a man riding a bicycle with high-intensity explosives strapped to it. 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists fly 2 aircrafts into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The following year, American journalist Daniel Pearl was abducted and beheaded in Pakistan. In 2008, 10 Pakistani terrorists killed more than 160 people in 48 hours of carnage in the Indian city of Mumbai. And more recently, in 2014, the Islamic State posted images of the beheading of 75 Syrian soldiers on their website. In 2016, a truck plows into a crowd celebrating Bastille Day in Nice, in France. From beheadings to suicide bombings and driving trucks into crowds, the imagination of the terrorist knows no limit. Each attack is designed to shock. The savagery plays out in full public view, numbing the mind, instilling fear in adversaries. There's no doubt the people carrying out such crimes are acting on direct orders. But why do they do so? The acts are savage, brutal. There's no allowance for humanity. Are these people psychopaths? Can we ascribe any medical condition to them which makes them behave this way? Or are they just amoral men going about their job in a detached manner, making a livelihood in the process? This response from Ajmal Kasab, the man captured in the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, perhaps holds an answer. For Kasab, it was the promise of a better life. For others, there could be a different motivating factor. What's clear is that we don't know what goes on in a terrorist's mind. In that sense, he will always have the advantage. Bureau Report, WION'.
Let's take a closer look at what creates these terrorists. How is their mind shaped? Joining me on Gravitas tonight is Mr. Tahir Abbas. He's a senior research fellow from the Royal United Services Institute from London. Also joining me in studio is Dr. Sunil Mittal. He's a criminologist and a psychiatrist. And Mr. Rohan Gunaratna, the international terrorism expert and author. He joins me from Singapore. Thank you all for joining me. Let me start by asking you, Tahir. You see the savagery and you see the challenges that are faced. Explain to me, how does somebody even decide to take the route of terrorism?
As your original comments pointed out, there are so many factors to take into consideration. There isn't a single unique formula that applies to all. So therefore, for very different people, there are very different motivations, expectations, and hopes. We can categorize the experience in the Western world as slightly different from that in the Eastern world, i.e. South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. In those societies, we have a lot more of corruption and inequality, unemployment, structural issues. But we also have similar problems facing Muslims in France, Germany, and Britain, where there are acute problems of social integration, social disadvantage, racism and discrimination, which make people feel that there's no stake for them, there's no hope, there's no future. And that is the starting point for a period of disintegration from society and retreat into forms of extremism that seemingly provide black and white answers, right or wrong answers to the burning questions that they have, many of which are about a function of identity.
Dr. Mittal, let me ask you, a lot of these people
Yes.
that we see committing these acts of terrorism, killing people, slitting people's throats, they have no record of, violence, criminal record. Some as young as 10, 11, 12 are sent out for suicide bombings. What makes them commit such savagery? It's almost unbelievable.
Right. And if you really look at the fact that all or most terrorist acts are designed to be savage, because as an idea, terrorism must instill fear. And that fear also in people who are, let's say, most vulnerable, and they're non-combatant. They're not people who are the typical targets of, let's say, an army assault. So it's actually the fear that has to be created. And in doing so, the acts have to be the most savage and appear as if it's going to happen to me. Because that's what's going to trigger a panic, an alarm, a sense of insecurity in the population groups that's targeted at.
How come these kids who have no experience,
Right.
they're not criminals at all in their
absolutely.
history?
So in carrying out these acts, the people who are involved are not really, there's nothing like a terrorist personality, they're not psychopaths, they're not antisocial necessarily, and they're not mentally ill, because most research shows that they're not ill. And some of them in today's time come from some of the most secure and educated backgrounds. So they've had a good upbringing. It's not that they've been violated or abused. Yes, stories are there that they're abused as children. So what becomes most attractive for them, that if you notice, most terrorists are young adolescents.
Very
They're
interesting.
men.
Very interesting.
They're men. And they find a sense of purpose, a sense of identity in the group that they sort of join on to. And like Tahir said, they come from backgrounds where they feel they are victims.
Peer pressure certainly seems to act. Let me bring in Mr. Gunaratne. Do you think groups like the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State operate on a similar ideology in trying to convert many of these children to become terrorists?
The ideology of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State is the same. There's no difference. In terms of methodology, the Islamic State is much more brutal. But if you take the idea of the caliphate, even Al-Qaeda advocated it. But the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, they created it. So what we are seeing is there's no fundamental difference between these two groups. The only distinction is that the Islamic State uses excessive violence to promote their aims and objectives.
No, so Tahir, let me get a little perspective from you on this. Do you think peer pressure really adds as one of those, something that pushes them towards, such savagery?
Very important mark about adolescence and testosterone. So these are young men going through a very important stage of biological change, and that sort of chemical development and sort of fusion in their brains is also part of a need to belong, a need to be the idea of a hero and a terrorist. They come from the same space. For some, the people who carry out these atrocities in the name of whatever political or religious paradigm they aspire to, for some, they're seen as heroes. For the rest of us, they're terrorists. So it is about belonging. It is about trying to find status in a situation where there are many pressures, and there are lots of examples of evidence to support the fact that these kids do come from very problematic backgrounds, criminality, sort of low-level crime to more dramatic issues of criminality, where turning to radicalization is a form of redemption. And there are also many, many studies that confirm that some of these young men suffer from various kinds of mental illnesses that are not detected. And while there's a great deal of focus on Islamist radicalism, and rightly so, for there is a scale issue there, the growing concern around far-right extremism, particularly in Europe and North America, is something that is not on the political agenda as it should be, because they are too facing similar issues of identity, belonging, a sense of restricted aspirations due to widening social divisions, and a sense of national identity which is not inclusive of them, which creates the idea of an ultra-nationalist violent project that seeks to redefine Englishness, which is a very exclusive concept devoid of notions of immigration or pluralism. And these kind of populist, radical, extremist sentiments are becoming recognizable in various spheres, including, it might be added, in parts of India and other parts of South Asia, i.e. in relation to the Rohingya in Myanmar. Buddhist extremists killing Muslims in the name of what? Political ideology. So there are many, many different complex factors associated. No two cases are the same, but we obviously need to think about context and an environment and backgrounds as important as anything else. In fact, the push factors are often far, far greater than the so-called pull factors, i.e. the idea of a caliphate, the idea of a pure, absolute utopian concept that is devoid of sin and so on.
Absolutely, Tahir. Beyond that, even seeing young children, I was up in Swat Valley in Pakistan, and I was taken to one of the re-radicalization centers. There were hundreds of people there in all ages, all the way from 10, 12 years old till 60 years old. And they were all at different stages of de-radicalization. The government had identified them as gray, which can be converted back. But one of the driving factors for all of these people was there was peer pressure. They were all working together. They came from small villages, and they all were recruited together and trained together in these radicalization centers, some of them even suicide bombing centers. Mr. Gunaratna, let me ask you, does the Islamic State thrive on the ruthlessness of their acts? And how ruthless do they have to be, and what kind of training goes into it?
The so-called Islamic State engages in the most ruthless crimes we have seen. It is because this group believes that it must instill fear into the enemy. And as a result, we have seen that they have conducted the most brutal crimes, terrorist crimes, history has witnessed.
So one of the challenges really is to kind of understand how this happens. Is there something in the medical science that can help explain the savagery that these children go through? To try and understand some of that, we took a deeper look at, is there something in medicine that can explain what these minds go through? And such brazen savagery makes us wonder, is it all just in the mind, or is there a medical condition that is responsible for such barbarism? In this segment, we try and make sense of this, medically speaking. What are a terrorist's giveaways? Research shows a potential terrorist has less control over the limbic system that generates emotions such as anger and rage. He or she has a greater tendency to take risks. The person is also said to have less self-control. The problem-solving skills are also poor. And researchers say all these traits show a person is inclined towards violence and antisocial behavior. Mr. Gunaratna, would you call these terrorists as psychopaths?
We have not met any terrorist who is psychopathic. I personally interviewed many members of Al-Qaeda and of the Islamic State. They are all driven by a terrorist and extremist ideology. They are not mentally ill. So the term psychopath does not apply to the terrorists, although they commit very brutal crimes, terrorist crimes.
Dr. Mittal, if you were to profile one of these terrorists, how would you go about it? Would there be a certain pattern to describe who they are?
Right. So I think if you were to look at people who have fall to the allure of terrorism, they would probably, we can look at some social determinants. We can look at their own individual personality, persona, which obviously reflects the biology as well, because our personality is not just psychological and is cultural as well. So if you look at it, that the people who are, firstly, they're young men. So they are prone to quick action. They have a sense of outrage and anger against perceived or actual injustice. And in doing so, they feel that they want a quick fix. They cannot resort to the long drawn-out process of constitutional other methods to seek redressal. And they want action. There is a presence of a strong leader who galvanizes them. And there are these young men who gain a sense of purpose, psychologically, socially speaking. Now, if you look at the brain structures, if you look at neuroscience today, we do understand that adolescence is a period when people are impulsive. That's why all military recruits young people. You don't recruit people who are 40 who have connections, who start thinking, their mental brakes start working. And young people are impulsive, especially during adolescence. There is the biological drive, there is a feeling of autonomy, there's a feeling that I can do something, and hey, here is a biological system which responds to it. So broadly speaking, say if any impulse hits me, it is carried from my lower brain through the brain process and into the limbic system and the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is the anger, rage. And in case an impulse is going through my brain, usually it's the frontal lobe, which is the more advanced logical brain, which should step in and say, hold on, don't do this, don't kill. Something else can be done. But the amygdala, the limbic system hijacks this impulse, if I can use that word, and a person responds immediately. And this is what actually all terrorist cults sort of utilize. The second is that when such a young person joins a group, the sense of self-identity is sort of dissolved. It's a group identity, which may be culturally driven. So there could be individualistic societies and societies which are also more linked.
Right.
Culturally, my identity is my culture, my space.
Sure.
And as a result, the group determines what I do. And therefore, something which I may not have done individually, which I considered savage, now the group decides and I go ahead and do it. It's dehumanized. And then it's killing an object. It's not killing a person. It's slitting the throat of an object, just like butchering.
Yeah, and the acceptability of that
and the acceptability and justification. There is a parallel narrative which is created, whether it's religious, political, ideological, that is justified.
You know, many children I've met over the years. A few years ago in Lahore, I met Sayyid Salahuddin, and he had a bunch of young children around him. They were all in their 16, 17, 18-year-old mark. And he'd got them together, and he was telling me how these kids had come to him asking for support and making sure that he had helped them carry out these acts. So it's surprising to see when you actually see a leader of a pack of terrorists and the kind of children he has around them, even in Pakistan in the Swat Valley. When we went in and to one of the terrorist camps, they were describing to us how between 12 to 15 kids were brought there. Some of them indoctrinated over the next few years and then sent on their final journey as suicide bombers. Some of them even given morphine on their final journey because some of them get scared as they go to blow themselves up. And so if that happened, they would always drug them before they went in and ignite their bombs through a cell phone. That was the usual process. And again, with so many suicide bombings happening across Pakistan, they had to deal with this. If you were really profiling, terrorists, you would try and understand what goes through their mind, and you would probably figure out a way how you will handle this going to the future. Mr. Tahir, could you describe this as a medical condition in any way, what these children go through and what some terrorists go through?
Well, I mean, I'm a professor of sociology, so I can only provide a sociological context in relation to what might drive these young men and women to carry out these atrocities. And I return back to some of the things I said earlier about the social context. You mentioned Swat. I've been to Swat. They've experienced 40 years of conflict. A quarter of the world's population live in conflict-ridden societies. So there are existing psychological trauma issues, there are social disintegration issues. We have to understand that terrorism is a product of the lives that people find themselves having to lead in the context of all the challenges that cannot be dealt with. So not every angry young person goes to terrorism, but some do. And these are particularly vulnerable people. And the work we do in our research and analysis institution, we want to understand what drives and also what can lead to effective solutions. And we find that the solutions are, again, mixed and dependent on context. If we improve human rights issues, we fundamentally reduce issues around conflict and therefore the risks in relation to terrorism. Human rights, economic development. A lot of these kids join Islamic State because it's a job. It's a job that provides a regular income, something that's been denied to them in the sphere of their own societies, whether it is Middle East and also whether it is Western Europe. So many, many factors that are behind the processes can be described as social rather than psychological, although I understand the value and importance of the psychology. And I just wanted to add on that. There is this concept of the moral brain, and my colleague, psychologist, who is far more informed in this area, may be able to tell us that people do make this judgment, this either the idea of right or wrong, black or white, which is born out of pressures and constraints. And this is also something to think about, a psychological condition.
You're absolutely right there. Even back in Swat, when they were taking them through de-radicalization, this was a Pakistani army program to de-radicalize some of these terrorists. What they were doing was they were giving them skills so that they can go back and work. They were teaching them how to be plumbers and electricians. And one of the things they realized that if once you release these children and some of these adults back into the villages, they have nothing else to do and they can go back towards terrorism. So making sure that they actually have a way to earn a living would help them not go back to terrorism. Time for us to take a short break now. Here on Gravitas, on the other side, we talk about what is it that motivates a person to take terrorism or to sustain this gory and ruthless business. Stay tuned. Back after the break.